Bienvenido a un nuevo evento de Cátedra Europa.
Good morning. On behalf of the 24th edition of Cátedra Europa, we give you a very warm welcome to the event, Grid Restoration Strategies for Low Inertia Distribution Grids with a High Penetration of Renewable Energy Resources, for which we have the special participation of Christoph Strong and Diana Racines. We leave you with Miss Diana Racines. Welcome, Miss Racines.
Yes, hello. I would like to briefly introduce our today's speaker, which is Christoph Strong. He is currently at the Technical University of Dortmund in Germany, and is a group leader from the research group of grid dynamics and stability. So he has a very wide experience working with low inertia grids or power system and renewable energy. So in today's conference, we're going to be able to get to know a little bit more about these challenges that arises when we have a lot of renewable energy in our power systems. So I will let Christoph now to begin with his talk now.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, my name is Christoph Strunk. I try to share my presentation with you. So I hope everyone can see the presentation right now. Today I want to talk a little bit about grid restoration strategies for low inertia distribution grids with a high penetration of renewable energy resources. For that, I have the following agenda for my presentation. First of all, I want to give a brief overview of the European power system. Then I would like to go into detail of some consequences of the energy transition we are facing right now. Then give a short overview of recent contingencies we had in the European power system, and then go into the grid restoration process and a short conclusion. Starting with the European power system. So we have 5 synchronous systems. The biggest one here in dark blue is the continental Europe one. And they are all interconnected with HVDC links, but not synchronous. So here we have an annual peak load of approximately 540 gigawatts and a consumed energy of over 3,000 terawatt hours per year. And especially the United Kingdom here is linked with 3 HVDC lines to France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, but they operate their system independently from that. It is just for the power exchange and energy exchange. On the map, you can see at the NSOE, which is the head of all transmission system operators in Europe for electricity. You can see how the transmission system lines are aligned inside of the system, but that is here just for the overview. In the last couple of years, we obviously experienced an increase in renewable energy systems. Here on the right side, there's growth from wind and solar, very obvious. In 2020, we had the first time where we had more electricity production from renewables than from fossil fuel. And as you can see, that is pretty significant if we look back 5 or even 3 years, where it was just at 30% and now it's almost at 40%. However, that is not the share of the gross final energy consumption. That is today at approximately 20% in Europe. So the mobility and the heat sector is also very important, and we need more renewables to also address this energy demand. How is it looking in Germany? So in Germany, we have 44.6% of renewable energy resources in the gross power production. And most of this is due to wind and also solar power, but also biomass. We have just a small share of hydropower with 3.3%. Yes, and more wind and solar. What we can also see here in Germany, we have an outage of nuclear power plants. They will shut down in the end of next year. So we see here that 11% will need to be taken over by the best scenario renewables. And we also have, we will stop coal-fired power plants in 2030 at the latest. And there will also come a lot of challenges with that. So we need a lot more wind and solar as well as biomass in the future. Where are these distributed energy resources connected? So if we see here on the right hand side, and I promise that will be the last statistical slide, we see that over 70% of the distributed energy resources are connected to the distribution grid level, so medium voltage and below. And so we see that the energy transition is happening in the distribution grid. And that changes the overall system from our old system here on the left side, where we had huge power plants in the extra high voltage level and in the high voltage level, and in the medium and low voltage level, just our loads. Today, the system already start to look like that. We have a lot of renewables and distributed energy resources, also like biomass plants and battery storages in the low and medium voltage level, and the large power plants in the extra high voltage level are shut down because of their carbon dioxide emissions. And what does this have for consequences? So we have less resilience of the grid. We the inertia of the power plants traditionally stabilized the grid. And now with the renewable energy resources, which are connected via converter, we don't have this resilience and that inertia anymore. And so the system needs new ways to be addressed or to be stabilized with frequency control power, which is provided faster in the future, or grid forming inverter as well. So there are a lot of challenges in the future, and we need to address them by including the distributed energy resources into the system and into the provision of ancillary services. And maybe that could be one question to look at, but here today I decided to talk about grid restoration strategies, and I want to give you a brief overview why I want to talk about that. We had some critical events in the European power systems in the past. The last one was in 2006, where a system split occurred, and we had three islands, one over frequency island here with half of Germany in it in the center, and then two under frequency islands in orange and blue The other half of Germany fell into the orange island. And that was, until this year, one of the biggest contingencies we had in the European power system. 3 years before, we had also a system split where Italy here in the south experienced a blackout after a system split between Italy and Switzerland. And that was a large-scale blackout for Italy, but not affecting the rest of the European system. Going to 2021, this year we already have seen 3 major contingencies. One in January, where a system split occurred and splitted the European system in 2 islands. In May, we saw a huge power plant outage in Poland. And in July, we had also another system split of the Iberic Peninsula down here. And I briefly want to go into these 3 contingencies. The first one in January, you can see here the split line. It started in Croatia here and was caused by a faulty protection device. And this led to a cascading event which splitted the system into 2 islands. And we had a power imbalance of 5.8 gigawatts. And that was very visible in the frequency. So here you see the blue island was in an under frequency island, and the frequency dropped until 49.75 hertz, which is pretty critical, but could be stabilized also very fast. And here you see the reconnection of the 2 islands. In the southeast area, you see there was a overfrequency, but also that could be stabilized pretty fast and nicely. And the report, so maybe one closer look here, we see that these changes happen really fast, and that the power plants who provided the ancillary services, which are mostly conventional power plants, stabilize the grid accordingly. The report of this incident revealed that this was not an issue in relation to the higher share of renewables, but rather just it was more or less a faulty protection device, and then a cascade of unlucky events happening at the same time. One other kind of contingency is a power plant outage. So if in May we had the power plant outage of the largest Polish power plant, and there was a loss of 3.9 gigawatts, which is also a lot. But we can see that the frequency could also be stabilized, and just for a short time was below 49.85 hertz, and then in 15 minutes could get back into a range where the frequency deviation was acceptable. And this was also on a day with a high share of renewables. So this is more an example that the renewables are not causing large problems, but that the system is still stable today. The third event, which I wanted to show you, was the system split of the Iberian Peninsula, and here was forest fires, and because of that, the system split here. because of a tripping of a transmission line between France and Spain. And the power imbalance was with 2.7 gigawatts, way lower than in the system split on January. And we can also see that in the frequency. So here in the blue island, we see that the frequency deviation is really minor. And whereas in Spain and Portugal, the frequency deviation was pretty high, and loads had to be scheduled for maintaining frequency stability. However, that was done appropriately, and we had no blackout. So, what are the key takeaways of these events? We have seen a significant increase of contingencies in 2021. Maybe it is just bad luck, but the reports showed that it was not due to the higher shares of renewables. In the first case, it was a faulty protection device. In the second, it was extreme weather. Or in the third, it was extreme weather, sorry. And a power plant outage can also occur because of different reasons. But it shows that today the system is pretty stable, but with the increasing share of renewables, the grid resilience will decrease, and we need to address these new challenges and include the distributed energy resources in our ancillary services and the stabilization of our grid. What another thing we see and experience is that blackouts and disturbances due to extreme weather situations are increasing. Here on the right side, I searched for blackouts which were caused by extreme weather conditions. And you can see that in 2001, there was no reported blackout because of extreme weather conditions. And since then, the number is increasing significantly. I think we all remember also the events in Texas at the beginning of this year. And there were many more examples, unfortunately. So in my opinion, it will increase even more. So what happens if a blackout occurs? So we have no electricity, we have no communication. How will we proceed? So first of all, we need a black start unit, some power plant which can be energized by itself, and then start the whole grid restoration process. If we have that, we take some preparatory actions like opening specific switches to guarantee a certain grid situation. Then we re-energize certain island grids or ramp-up grids in the transmission system. And from there, we connect loads and power plants which are in own consumption or which need to be started. And with that, we start to introduce the frequency containment of these power plants and try to stabilize this grid segment. Then we mesh up the grid to increase the grid size and also the resilience of the grid. And then we connect additional loads for increasing the loading of the power plants. And we start up and reconnecting further power plants. That is the part where the grid restoration is in focus. So here we just want to build up the grid and make a stable grid segment before connecting the loads. The next focus would be the load restoration, where we connecting additional loads and additional generation units and meshing the grid more and more, and also connecting with the other TSOs which are around us. And after that, if we restored our grid, we are in load following operation. So we need to ensure the power balance, and then we also want to restart the market processes, because obviously during a black start or a grid restoration, the markets are out of order, and the main purpose is on restoring the grid stable and reliable and as fast as possible. So markets are not active at that point. So concluding, the grid restoration is coordinated by the TSOs, and today it is highly dependent on conventional power plants. So black start units are often hydro or pumped storage power plants or hydropower plants or fast gas-fired power plants, and they are in the transmission system. They are black started, and then from there the grid is being restored. The communication at that time among the TSOs, but also between the TSOs and the DSOs, is done via phone. And the DSOs are responsible for assuring a certain load, because we want to increase the load step by step, but in the range of the permissible load steps of the power plants. So the DSOs are somehow responsible, but it is very hard for them to determine how much load is being reconnected to their grid. So this is a hard task for them as well as for the TSOs. And if we have a large scale blackout, it is a lot of coordinational effort to assure a stable grid restoration. Which restoration strategies do we have? So here on the right side, there is an overview. So traditionally, we are just in the first row here, where we have either the case that one TSO is still energized and can help the other TSOs, or we have the case that TSO is or all TSOs, it's a large scale blackout and no TSO is energized. And if we have this, the TSOs are black starting their own grid and then meshing up their own grid and reconnecting at a later time. But it is also possible to have a mixture between this. So if we have a TSO which is energized and the second TSO which experienced a blackout starts some grid segments on its own and gets help from the TSO from another point. So that is the traditional way. This is pretty, it can be mixed up because it is named top down if another TSO helps a TSO which has a blackout, and bottom up if both TSO, if all TSOs are in a blackout and restoring their grid. Bottom up here does not mean that the DSOs are helping in restoring the grid. Yes, that is named build up or build together. So in the last row here, we see that the DSO can also black start their grid or restore their grid and then help the TSO. But I think that is very hypothetical and even more challenging than it is today. And I would say in the future, a build together would be an appropriate step to restore a grid where DSO, who has the capability of restoring their own grid, can help a TSO which also restores their grid. And yeah, so it is a sped up process for all participants. Focusing a little bit on this two options. Yes, as we have seen, decentralized energy resources already today have a share of above 40% of the electricity production. This will increase even further. In 2050, we want to have 80% of renewables. And they need to be included in the grid restoration, obviously, and they are installed in the distribution system. So we need to also take the distribution system operators and try that they can restore their grid and help the TSOs, or at least restore their grid until the transmission system operator is ready to reconnect their grid. And with that, we can guarantee a faster restoration process for all customers. And already today in Germany, so I can speak for Germany, a lot of DSOs have the theoretical capability to restore their grid if there is a large-scale blackout. However, they don't have the plans yet, and a lot of conditions must be met. So, for example, in the distribution system, we don't have remote controllable circuit breakers or also reliable communication links between the DSO and the distributed energy resources or the generators. And we need also some reliable feed in from battery storages or CHP plants or something like that. And we also need to have a certain knowledge of our grid. So traditionally, we don't have some state estimation in the distribution system. We need that, but also a forecast for loads and weather to determine our in-feed and our capability. So if we want to restore a distribution grid, how does that look? First of all, we need some black site units that can be a battery storage or a CHP plant. And then we try to connect some loads and assure a certain frequency. Here, we need to consider some effects like cold load pickup from the loads. So after a blackout, we have a higher load than we had before the blackout. This is due to a diversity factor for fridges or air conditioning or something like that. Everything at the beginning after a blackout is switched on simultaneously and will cool or heat or whatever at the same time. Also, we have effects like magnetization of transformers and stuff like that. So we need to consider this as well. Then we would reconnect feeder by feeder, and there we will see some renewables like PV plants, wind turbines, which will reconnect to the grid at some point. Then maybe we have a larger feeder where there is a higher load, and we will get below a certain frequency threshold. This could mean that renewables will shut down because of a frequency violation. And after that, we would have an even higher load step and maybe another blackout after that. So we want to avoid that and consider that, so that we can restore the distribution grid and have a load following operation after that. And how do we do that? What are our possibilities? Here, I just want to give you a broad overview of the capability of the distributed energy resources we have. Basically, here CHP plants or biomass plants have a lot of benefits. They have inertia. They are often connected via a motor to the grid. They don't have too much fluctuation. And they also can provide ancillary services and are black start capable often. However, they are not as fast as, for example, battery storages or also wind turbines, which you can see here. But they are pretty important for a distribution grid restoration process. Hydropower plants are also very important and provide also inertia to the grid and are often black start capable. However, they, in Germany at least, I know in Colombia it is very different. They are pretty small and not as distributed throughout Germany, so they are often not available. And then battery storages, we have a lot of benefits from them, and they could also provide virtual inertia, but they are very expensive and also not that distributed today. PV power plants are more or less a disturbance factor during our black start, so they could provide a base load of some kind, but they have a lot of fluctuating effects which need to be considered, and it could happen that they are so they are feeding into our grid, and then a certain frequency threshold is violated because of a feeder reconnection, and then they are shutting down, and everything will get more difficult. And wind turbines have also a lot of fluctuation, but they are mostly pretty high or pretty in the plant size, and they could also provide some base loading and have more reliability as PV power plants. So here is just an overview of everything I just said. We see CHP, battery storages, and hydropower plants are important for the grid restoration. So we don't want it is not realistic that every distribution system operator can black start their grid. That should also not be the goal, but a lot of them have the capability because they have somehow enough of these power plants inside of their grid, and then maybe some more like remote controllable circuit breakers and stuff like that. During a grid restoration, it is also very important to have a control scheme for your participating generators, because without that, it is not possible to restore the grid. So here in red, there is an example for the load. So we see here also the cold load pickup. At the beginning, it is pretty high and then declining. And we need some fast-acting generators, generation units like battery storages in the beginning to provide the necessary power to the grid. And here in blue, we see a CHP plant, which should take over the load and provide a certain base load. And PV and wind is often, or some larger plants are, you are able to curtail them as a distribution system operator, but not really all of them, and at least not the household PV plants. And that is also very important for your consideration. So something like that must be implemented in a distribution system by the DSO to maintain or to assure a grid restoration. So what I want to show you now is an example of a German distribution system operator where we worked together and implemented these control schemes and investigated the grid. And you see here the overview of the grid. It is a 20 kV medium voltage grid with certain nodes here. The black dots you see, there are the aggregated low voltage grids, which we considered with loads, synchronous machines, and also voltage sources without any inertia for PV plants, for example. Here, 17,000 customers are connected, and they have an annual peak load of 18 megawatt and an annual peak feedback of 13 megawatt. So you see a lot of renewables are installed to that grid, namely here the 2 wind parks in the northern part of the grid and here in the western part of the grid. There are also 2 possible black start units, 1 battery storage here, and 1 battery storage with a CHP plant here at the lower part of the grid, and which is not yet available but could be in the future is the wind park in the north. So that could also become a black start unit in the future. And what is very special here is that they have remote controllable circuit breakers. So in every red circle, the circuit breakers are remote controllable by the control system of the DSO. So with that, we started some investigations and we simulated the grid with dynamic simulations. We tried to model the wind farms and PV plants and CHP plants in the grid as realistic as possible to get a grid restoration plan. So here you see some results for the grid restoration process, which can look like that. And you see here that a frequency of below 46 hertz can be happening during a grid restoration in the distribution grid, because we have not enough inertia to avoid that. And for that, we also need the battery storage, which can provide fast power due to the reconnection of certain feeders. And if we zoom in here to this situation, we see that we considered here the station where we could switch we have a lot of switching options. And here on the right side, you see how the frequency deviation would be if a certain switch would be switched on. And you see the green one was chosen. So switch 1 here was chosen because we not only need to consider how the frequency deviation of every switch is, but rather what we reconnect. So can we build up more inertia? Are there more CHP plants behind a switch? And could we mesh up the grid more stably if we choose now a worse switch regarding to the frequency progression than to do it with a lower frequency deviation. So that is one part. And another is that if we delay critical switching operations to the end, it could mean that the PV plants at the end would shut down, and that we will get to another blackout, and we want to avoid that. And with these investigations, we see which switches in which weather situations are dangerous and maybe problematic. And we can identify some things where the DSO needs to see if they can act on that, or if it's maybe not possible to reconnect everything in the grid, but just the core grid to maintain a reliable operation. Concluding, we have a lot of challenges in the grid restoration of distribution grids. We have a low inertia. We have a lot of small distributed generation units. It is not possible to really change the control schemes of small renewables like household PV plants or battery storages. We need circuit breakers that are remote controllable, because if a person needs to drive to every circuit breaker, that takes days to restore the grid. And we have often no information about the load situation or the topology of the grid after blackout. And and we need to consider a lot of dynamic effects like cold load pickup, the behavior of the distributed generators, and also different strategies, like I mentioned, with the frequency deviation. And also, what is really important here are the changing weather conditions. So you also need a reliable forecast model for the weather in your grid, so you know what will come to your grid. So today, renewables are already playing a key role in our power system, and they are also able to take over the task of ancillary services for a reliable grid operation. However, we need to include them in our planning, not only for ancillary services, but especially for grid restoration. And with that, we also need to consider the weather effects and influences. So it is not enough to just have one grid restoration plan, like it's often the case today. We need more depending on the load and weather situations. So it will get more challenging in the future. Yes, we also have more dynamic effects on the grid. So it is not, we need to consider all the small distributed energy resources, how they are controlled, what influence they have, what stability issues arise from that. So we need to investigate that with dynamic models which are suitable. And we also need to consider the information and communication part more, because for everything I just mentioned, it is obviously a key to have a secure communication link to your blacksite units and to the other DSOs and TSOs. So we need to investigate also this more in the future. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Okay, maybe I would like to ask you one or two questions.
Sure.
On one side, you mentioned that nowadays there are, at least in Germany, some DSOs that can perform or that could be able to perform this grid restoration for themselves or in this grid. But yeah, the question would be: is this somehow, or are there some regulation for that, or maybe in the near future it could be possible to be these regulations?
Um, you mean with that the DSOs are need to be black start capable in this case, or if they get some incentives for being black start capable?
Yes, or if they are Black Star capables, if there are already some regulations that they must follow, or it's just they are Black Star capable but no regulations.
Yeah, so at the moment there is nothing like that implemented because it is not considered yet that distribution systems are black start capable or are participating in the black start process or in the grid restoration. It is just today a TSO would manage all of that with their power plants, and the DSO would have no benefits or disadvantages from that. And there are also no regulations how the distribution system operator needs to perform the restoration process because it has not happened yet.
Yes, and then as you mentioned, some challenges must be first resolved. So maybe in the future that could be possible.
Yes, I know that, for example, in Chile, there is a market for black start capability. At the moment, more for power plants, but they also distribution system operators could participate in that. So maybe that could be something for the future as well.
Okay. And well, maybe just one last thing. Just to maybe give a little bit frame to all the people also, as you mentioned, in Colombia it is of course the how we produce the energy is very different. We have indeed a lot of hydro power plants, but unfortunately at the distribution level we don't really have much wind power or PV power or battery storage. So maybe this black star capability coming from the distribution system can see or can be seen as something far still. But regarding the challenges about for example, the circuit breakers that must be remote controllable and so, maybe to what extent does Germany already have that?
In the transmission system, everything is remote controllable, so there's no, so everything is known basically. On the distribution system, it is, I cannot tell you exactly, but it is very rare. So it is, I would say, like 5 to 10%, but that's just a gut feeling. So
Okay.
yeah, that was an exceptional distribution system operator, which whom we worked together, who at one stage said, "Okay, I renew all substations and I will consider remote controllable circuit breakers." It is not, I think, if a DSO today changes their circuit breakers, I think they will, if they are in their right mind, always choose the control remote controllable. But that is a process to get there. I think it is just in the last couple of years becoming more attractive. So I think it is in 10 years from now, I think it is implemented much more than today.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Just get an overview for everybody.
Yeah.
Well, that would be my last question, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you again for being here today at Cátedra Europa.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
We would like to thank Mr. Strong and Ms. Racines for their participation and all the attendees for joining us in this session of Cátedra Europa. We invite you to continue supporting the education of talented students through our scholarship fundraising campaign, Más Becas, by clicking on the donation button on the homepage of Cátedra Europa. We also encourage you to stay tuned with Cátedra Europa events.